In Classic WoW, the racials are not exactly super balanced, so some of them do perform much better with certain classes than others. And in this list, I'll go over which ones are the best combinations, but mainly for PvE, and I'll go over that a bit more as we go into our first part on the list. And at number 10, we have the Undead Race with Rogue, Priest, Mage, and Warlock. And this is only on this list for its PvP applications. PvP in Classic WoW is a little weird because there's no rated PvP. PvP consists of Battlegrounds and World PvP, and both of those are inherently unbalanced because of the massive amounts of people involved in the variations in which you'll find each other. And it's to the point where some of the most efficient ways to PvP in Classic WoW is to just spam AoEs. So, which racials are best in PvP is very subjective, which is why this will be one of the only spots on this list relating to its PvP usefulness. And Undead have one of the best PvP racials in the game in the form of Will of the Forsaken. The earliest version of Will of the Forsaken was the most broken racial in the game's history, as it allowed them to just be passively immune to fear, charm, and sleep effects. It was later changed at the start of Vanilla WoW to only give immunity for 20 seconds, and could be used if you were subject to one of those CCs. And it was overpowered in this version as well. It was then later nerfed to give immunity for 5 seconds and also break those 3 forms of CCs, which is what it will be like in Classic WoW, and this version is also very strong, especially since PvP trinkets in Classic WoW only break certain kinds of CC and not all of them. And Fear is one of the more prevalent CCs run in PvP. And the reason I didn't list Warriors, along with all of the other classes that an Undead can be, is because they can already break out of fears with Berserker Rage, but even they are fine with being undead for PvP because you can never have too many ways to break out of CCs. And at number 9, we have the Tauren Warrior Tank, specifically. Now, if you're a Horde and you want to play a Warrior and want to dabble in PvP, you have the fine option of a Tauren Warrior. Since they have fears dealt with thanks to Berserker's Rage, they don't gain as much benefit from Will of the Forsaken as the other undead classes. And they have War Stomp, an AoE stun for 2 seconds, which is really good for melee classes in PvP. And if you do PvE, Tauren tanks have the highest health pools out of all the tanks, thanks to their racial endurance, which gives them a 5% increased total health. And tanks do like having extra health. Now, the only problem with the Tauren Warrior tanks is there is a better option, which I'll talk about later on in this video. But Taurens are still pretty solid at this one distinction nonetheless, just not super good at it, and that's why they're only at number 9 on this list. And at number 8, we have the Troll Shaman. Out of all the 3 races that can be shamans, Trolls win out because they have Berserking, which will give them a 10% haste increase for like 10 seconds, with the chance of it going up to a 25% haste increase the lower they are on health. And since Shamans are primarily healers in PvE, this is the only race that actually gives any kind of healing advantages, which makes it the best of the 3. But it's not the strongest race/class combination when compared to a lot of the more top spots on this list. And at number 7, we have the Troll Hunter. Out of all the races that can be hunters, only the Trolls and Orcs have racials that increase their damage, and the Orcs racial only increases the damage of their pets by 5%. Which does not translate to a lot of overall damage since the highest DPS spec is Marksman, and their Bloodfury racial only affects melee attacks. So, if you want to become a melee hunter, then the Orc is the best race for you. But if you want to go Marksman, then Troll is your best bet because of their Berserk racial, which can increase their haste by 10 to 25% for 10 seconds, and can allow them to cast their aim shot quicker, and can provide a much higher DPS increase than a passive 5% more pet damage if you're able to line up your cooldowns and abilities with it properly. Now, on the Alliance side, most people will pick the Night Elves for hunters, specifically because they have the highest base agility in the game out of all the other hunters, because none of the other Alliance races actually have racials that increase their hunter damage. And coincidentally, Trolls actually have the second highest base agility out of all the hunters, which kind of makes them even more of the best race to pick. Dwarves have a +5 increase to gun skills, but weapon skills don't really matter for ranged weapons, unless you can get it up to a +15 in that weapon skill, in which case it would only give you an extra 1% chance to hit. But with only a +5, like the gun skill that dwarves have, and the bow skill that trolls have, as trolls also have a racial that give them a +5 weapon skill in bows, that's not going to do very much for you unless you're able to increase it by an additional 10, which is not easy, and to add to that, I'm not even sure if it's possible, as there are very few items and enchants in the game that increase your weapon skill. So the Troll Hunter wins out because basically all the other classes just aren't as good in comparison. And at number 6, we have the Gnome Warlock. Gnomes have a racial called Expansive Mind, which increases their total intellect by 5%. And intellect in vanilla WoW increased your maximum mana pool and also your spell crit. Though I should mention, intellect did not increase your spell power in vanilla WoW. So it was just the spell crit and mana pool increase that Warlocks wanted from the racial, as getting 5% more than all other Warlocks is a pretty decent advantage to have, making Gnomes the undisputed kings for Warlock DPS racials, based on Expansive Mind alone. And the best a Horde Warlock could hope for is the Orc Warlock, thanks to their command ability, which increases the damage of their pets by 5%, which is even less useful for Warlocks than it is for Hunters. Gnomes also have the Escape Artist racial, and one of the smallest character models in the game, which made them harder to click on, which was actually a legitimate advantage in vanilla WoW PvP. So, they had some good uses in PvP as well, in addition to their engineering racial bonus, as engineering was one of the most powerful professions in vanilla WoW. And at number 5, we have the Gnome Mage, for basically the same reason as the Gnome Warlock, the 5% increase to intelligence. Basically, if you're playing a DPS caster class and you have the Gnome available to you in vanilla WoW, you want to be a Gnome for the Expansive Mind racial, of which there are only 2, the Mage and Warlock. And they also have the benefits of the Escape Artist and the Engineer increase as well. So you'll probably see a lot of Gnome Mages in PvP, because Escape Artist is not half bad, even if it does have a cast time in order to break roots in vanilla WoW. Now, if you're playing a Horde Mage, you obviously don't have Gnome available as an option, so the best race to pick is Troll for the Berserking, as casting faster as a caster is always good. And at number 4, we have the Human Rogue. Humans have this racial called Perception, which when activated, for the next 20 seconds, you have an increased stealth detection. So, in a Rogue v Rogue matchup, human rogues can find other rogues more easily. And humans also gain 10% additional reputation for all rep gains, allowing them to grind out the many reputations of vanilla WoW much easier. Neither of these things are why rogues are so high on this list though. The real reason human rogues are so good is because of mace and sword specialization. These 2 specializations increase your weapon skills with one-handed maces and swords, and two-handed maces and swords by 5. Now, unlike weapon skills for ranged weapons, weapon skills for melee weapons are actually incredibly valuable. You see, ranged weapons can't be dodged, parries, or produce glancing blows, which melee weapons can be, which means melee weapons miss or do less damage much more often. And against boss level targets, the average melee weapon will be a glancing blow 40% of the time. And a glancing blow means your weapon only does 70% of the normal damage and is incapable of a crit. Now, per point of weapon skill past the maximum of 300 increases the amount of damage you do during a glancing blow by about 3%. So, having a +5 in weapon skill increases the damage of your glancing blows by 15%, bringing up the total to 85% of normal damage every time you landed a glancing blow, instead of 70% of normal damage. And this 15% increase translates to about 6% more auto attack damage, and auto attack damage should account for a large chunk of your total damage. So it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say that this one racial could increase your total damage against bosses by about 3%. And weapon skills increase your damage even further against less than boss level mobs, as against elite mobs who are only 2 levels higher than you, you'll do 10.5% more damage with your auto attacks with only a +5 in weapon skill, which is usually the level of most mobs that appear in boss encounters. And since weapon skills increase your damage by this much, having a +5 in 2 weapon skills, one of them being the most common best in slot weapons, the one-handed swords, means humans have a very good damage ratio when it comes to melee classes, putting them near the top of the list, especially with rogues where a lot of their damage comes from weapons, but not all of it. And at number 3, we have the Orc DPS Warrior. Orcs also have a weapon skill increase in the form of axe specialization, which gives you a +5 weapon skill in 1- and 2-handed axes. So if an Orc DPS Warrior is using an axe, they will deal 6% more auto attack damage to boss level mobs, and 10.5% more auto attack damage to just elite level mobs. In addition to that, orcs also have Bloodfury, which increases their melee attack power by 25% for 15 seconds, which is a pretty good damage ratio on top of having the weapon skill ratio. But since this cooldown also reduces the healing you take by 50% for 25 seconds, that makes them not very good for tanking, as you definitely don't want to nerf the heals you're taking as the tank. Of course, you can just get around this by not using this racial, and instead just take advantage of the axe specialization. And orcs also have their hardiness racial, which is really good in PvP, and is kind of a deterrent to rogues wanting to stun you or pick you out of the crowd. All of this put together makes orcs easily the best race for horde players if you want to play a DPS warrior. But then again, they're pretty good for tanking too, as threat actually mattered a lot back then, so doing more damage with your one-handed axe is also good for tanking. And at number 2, we have the Human Warrior, both the tank and DPS versions. Now, the reason there's lots of warriors on this list is because every race could be a warrior in vanilla WoW, so they kind of had the cream of the crop when it came to race class combinations. And Human Warriors make this list for the same reasons why I put the Human Rogue on the list, and that's for the weapon skills racials. Most DPS warriors will dual wield weapons, and having a weapon skill increase in 2 of them means you have much more options for using a weapon that fits your racial than the orcs who can only use axes. And most of the best one-handed weapons in the game are swords, which gives humans the edge over the DPS orc warriors. And for their tanking specs still, having the increase in weapon skills is just really good. And since they can use either maces or swords, you have more options for gearing up your tank and using those weapon skills. Now, if you want to go for a warrior tank who actually has defensive racials, the Dwarf Warrior does pretty good, as Stone Form allows you to clear bleeds and basically all other magical effects, and just gives you 10% reduced physical damage for its duration, which is a really good ability for a tank to have. And even Night Elves have a racial which gives them an increased 1% chance to dodge. And even when compared to those other 2 racials, the Human Warrior is still better because of those weapon skills. A +5 in weapon skills is just a really good racial to have for melee fighters, and could have easily put them at the number 1 spot if it wasn't for the actual number 1 spot on this list. And at number 1, we have the Dwarf Priest. You see, priests have priestly racials on top of their normal racials, and the Dwarf Priest specifically is given the FearWard racial, which on a 30-second cooldown allows you to place a buff on someone for 10 minutes, which will negate the effect of 1 fear. Now, this is a pretty situationally useful ability, as it's not as versatile as a lot of the other racials I talked about, but in the situations in which it's useful, boss fights that have a fear, it's so useful that people will bring a Dwarf Priest to raid even if they have absolutely no gear, just to have FearWard. And FearWard is so useful in those situations that Alliance actually has a slight edge over the Horde when it comes to raiding because they have FearWard available to them, and the Horde does not. If one racial is so good that it gives your entire faction an edge, that means it earns the number 1 spot on this list. But that's not it. Dwarves also still have the Stone Form racial as well, which is really good in PvP and on some raid fights, even for a priest. And they also have another priestly racial in the form of Desperate Prayer, which is an instant cast self-heal that can be used in an emergency to heal themselves to save them from dying. A spell that healing priests have in the live version of WoW as their emergency heal cooldown, and it originated as a dwarf and human racial, as each priest was actually given 2 racials, and one of them was shared with another race. So, only dwarves got FearWard, but both dwarves and humans got Desperate Prayer, which is a very useful emergency heal, even if it also had a 10-minute cooldown in vanilla WoW. They loved to give what they thought were powerful abilities back then overly long cooldowns. Alright, and that's the end of the list. You may have noticed I did not include Druids or Paladins on this list, And that's because Druids only have one race available to them for both factions. So if you want to play a Druid as Horde or Alliance, you don't have a choice in which race you get to pick, as it's either Tauren or Night Elf. And for Paladins, even though they were only available to the Alliance, they only had 2 races to choose from, and both Dwarves and Human Paladins were alright, and neither was overly better than the other. But if you really want to play a Ret Paladin, I guess, Human would be the go-to for their weapon skill specializations. And other than that, if you think I missed any other very important race class combos that should have been in this video, or have ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments.